Thank you for taking this call and being a
Oh
part
yeah,
of this interview.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
could you introduce yourself to the audience and maybe say a little about your background?
Sure. So I'm Matt Sargent. I am a composer. I also work as a computer programmer, guitarist, and recording engineer. And so, as far as my background, um, various aspects of my music have been sort of informed by those other careers over the years. Involving programming in my notation. Having a performance background, so being quite aware of the performer side of the equation when designing scores. And of course, most of my music involves some form of engineering, whether it's layers of recorded sound or something like that. So those four things have sort of been interwoven like throughout my music making.
Ah, I see. And this piece that will be on the program Songs Clouds, uh, could you talk a little bit about, how this piece came together
Mhm.
and maybe your relationship to the piano?
Yeah, sure. So the piece uses, I guess I'm thinking of it in two ways. The piece uses a real time score. So I'm saying this for, this obviously, but saying this for viewers. The piece uses a real time score. So it generates completely in real time and follows unique paths during every performance. And so this has been something that I've been working on as far as a larger connection of pieces since about 2009. And it took me from around 2009 to around 2015, 16 to feel like I could actually make music in this algorithmic format that really felt like something. And so, as far as the piece coming about, I've been working the slow process of um, just considering what it means to have composition happen in real time, where my voice fits into that equation, all that sort of thing. And so, this has been another working out of that. Um, so the piano I've been hesitant to approach for years for some reason. Um, Probably the main thing, just the availability of amazing repertoire. So I've written a lot for percussion, which is a rather young instrument when it comes to classical music. I'm myself a guitarist, and guitarists are famous for actually having just a sort of a lack of deep repertoire. Like we just do not have, our Beethoven sonatas and things like that. And so
Mhm.
every time I've thought about the piano, it's always been that question of like, well, what do I have to add? Because I know so many good piano pieces, and why have one more from me? Um, so I think when this email conversation came up to lead to this commission, um, thinking about ways of making my real time notation uh, material that I was working on, ways of making that work contrapuntally and a little bit more vertically were already sort of on my mind. And that seemed like something that I just hadn't quite seen before for the piano. And so that seemed like a reason to start um, pursuing this direction. And so, yeah, a lot of my thinking, I had just come off of writing a solo guitar piece actually, and so that's a fairly narrow range compared to the piano. And so a lot of my thinking was about how to think in, um, you know, slightly bigger chords, at least within my musical language, and make something that actually fits within that range, and also within that sort of playing style, the voicings and things like that. And so a lot of the initial work was just sort of teaching the computer what putting one's hands on the piano sort of feels like, basically, so that you don't end up with these chords that are spread out across several octaves and things that the piano just doesn't do.
Mhm.
Um, so that was sort of the start. I think that there's been this longer theme of thinking about the score as this real-time object, and the computer has a bit of agency within that relationship. And then also just finding a way to do something with the piano. New is not really the word, but just feels like a contribution that I could have towards the repertoire.
Mhm.
Versus I think if left purely up to my own devices, it's like Feldman piano works, for example, are so in my mind. And
Mm-hmm.
so I've always been hesitant to just accidentally write, a Sargent Feldman piece, like in the way that Morton Subotnick refers to things as being new old music or something like that.
Mm.
So this seemed like an occasion to actually try something that I hadn't quite heard before and I didn't quite know how it would turn out. Um, so, the sort of like experimental drive that drives a lot of my music started sort of chiming and ideas started coming up.
Mm-hmm. What is it? Thank you for all that. Uh,
Mhm.
this is the only piece on the program with the electronics. Could you talk a little bit about how you brought electronics into this piece, and especially how it relates to the piano score?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is that the electronics and the piano score are both derived from the exact same material.
Mm,
The electronics are these very, very, very long sustained tones that are basically building this sort of harmonic overtone map that the attacks of the piano live within.
mhm,
And so, as far as the background material, it actually has exactly the same um, source material. It just does radically different things with it. I've done a few other pieces that have roughly this kind of foreground background relationship, and often it's something like bowed vibraphone plus struck vibraphone, so that many layers of bowed vibraphone recordings, and then struck vibraphone is sort of the foreground live player. Um, and so I was thinking here about, I guess, there's sort of two interests. I was initially thinking about the possibility of the ebow, and the range of the ebow on the piano is, of course, quite narrow. And I was really interested in widening the upper range, particularly in the electronics.
mm,
And so that was discounted right away, but I had the sort of timbre of ebow, that kind of rich sine tone like ringing in my
mhm,
mind. And so I started designing the patch as basically a meta ebow in a way, and then it built from that. Um, and then the second direction is I was just thinking about having this sort of, I guess, a combination of sort of a bed of sustain for the piano to live in, and then also this feeling that the sustain of the piano is forming this kind of meta instrument relationship with the electronics, meaning that there are these attacks and then they seem to just grow out into open space of sustained tones over, a minute or 2 minutes.
mhm,
Um, and so that all sort of formed the thinking about making this rather complex collection of sine tones. There are 210 individual sine tone tracks happening on the piece, and so that gave me some flexibility to dial in all kinds of timbres behind the piano using stacks and stacks and stacks of sine tones.
mm. Awesome. Let's see. I know this is going to be a part of a larger work that we're going to be
Mhm.
working on after this concert. Could you say a little about how it from an originally 8-10 minute piece would end up becoming 72 minutes or so?
Oh, sure. So I think the initial thing is I have such a bad habit of whenever anyone asks me to do a small task, I immediately think of a giant task.
Mhm,
And so part of what I do as a composer is a lot of free writing. And one of the things that really stuck, free writing just means sort of,
mhm,
open writing paragraphs to describe what a piece might be before truly diving in with notation. And one of the things that really stuck is I had written down on a page just this piece could be 72 minutes long, rather than thinking in an 8 minute form.
mhm,
And something about having that wider form, all of a sudden I started jumping to all these um, ideas. And so um, I think basically my strategy starting off was to just work on a really big form, knowing that I would hit upon something that would become a really interesting small form. And like we talked about over email, I've done this in other pieces too, where I've essentially started what I knew would be a much longer term process by kicking it off with some small chunk of the piece as a standalone composition. And so I think I have this overarching interest in smaller pieces of mine feeling as if it's a world that could have gone on in either direction for a lot longer.
Mm,
And so to me, that's always been one way to approach it in a somewhat genuine way, is that like I literally write just a larger form than the piece actually is. And so you're hearing kind of this section of this big thing.
mm,
And so this indeed is, I think, the opening 10 and a half minutes or so of what will be more of a concert length piece. And so my thinking about this versus a longer piece is that this is just starting to sort of open up the possibilities of the wider piece. So the last few minutes of this piece, you start getting slight clouds of notes, more busyness, slightly wider profiles across the piano. And so this is sort of this introduction that then the stuff that's coming after will answer. And what the other stuff is, I haven't quite sorted out yet. I'm somewhere out around 35 minutes or so
mm,
into the piece. But I think as far as the information for this concert, I just have this interest in smaller pieces of mine still feeling like they're larger pieces, having this sort of timelessness to them, I guess. So that, a 6 minute piece could sort of imply this larger piece, or a 10 minute piece could imply this larger piece. And so, yeah, one way that I've always thought about that is simply thinking in a much longer form than the short piece is. There's an example in painting that I go to sometimes. If you know Clifford Still's paintings,
mm,
he often starts, so there are these color fields, of course,
mhm,
and he often starts a new color field way out on the corners of the frame, implying that even though the frame is huge in his paintings, 5 or 6 feet
mm,
tall, way up in the corner, there's the start of what feels like was going to be even more. And so just looking at this thing, you have this implication that it's a stopped version of something that was probably much longer. And things like that have always sort of excited me, that there's this awareness that, the composition is the sort of temporal boundary of a certain experience. But of course, as musicians, our experience with sound is like much longer than that. And so I've tried to think of smaller forms in that way, as, yeah, expression of something longer, bigger, more timeless.
mm,
So in this piece, I think it's quite literal that we'll ultimately have these two versions. One that's much more of a recital length version. It kind of gets you into the feeling of the piece, and then right as you're sort of sunk in, like, the time is expired and it's over.
mhm,
And then the other one will be a space to really live in that sound world for a while. So that's sort of exciting. We'll see where the other one goes.
mhm. Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for doing this, Matt.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
yeah, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'm gonna go back to sleep.
Okay, great.
Okay,
Yeah, I'll talk to you soon.
sounds good. See ya.
Great. See ya.